Has anyone been out into the backcountry since our latest snowstorm? Oh, there's a hand. Good for you. How was it? Nice. Well, I can tell you that I went out a couple times since this new snowstorm, and it's been a very interesting experience. We do have snow, yay, but it comes with a couple caveats, if you will. So we have a snowpack. We have snow below 9,000 feet now, like actual snow, which is sweet. So we can actually get places. It just might be a little bit of an endeavor. As you can see in these pictures, the snow snakes are very active. Lots of manzanita, lots of bushes still poking through. And the way that the snow came in our most recent storm, it was a bit upside down. So if you were out, you may have experienced getting attacked by the snow snakes and sinking into the bushes. It's settling a little bit. It's starting to settle nicely, but if you do head out, keep your tips up. Our height of snow in this elevation range on average was 50 to 75 centimeters, so around 2 feet. That's pretty good. Here's a general idea of what our snowpack structure looks like in some lower elevations. You can see, oh, I have a clicker, cool. It doesn't work very well. I'll point. You can see there's a nice big uniform layer from the top of our snowpack down, and that is the new storm snow, and it is settling nicely, yay. You can see right down in there's like a line, right? You can see that. That is our first of multiple melt freeze crusts throughout our forecast region. They're variable in thickness, and they're variable in where they are and how they are, which makes things a little complicated. Below that, we have a couple different layers of different things, but to summarize it cleanly, we have our January 2nd facets that we're starting to show signs of healing, and hopefully that will continue. We'll circle back on that. And then below that, we have our December depth hoar. If you followed along with our forecast, you've heard us talk a lot about depth hoar. Depth hoar is kind of like the theme of our season so far, unfortunately. We'll circle back on that as well. But you can see it in here, mixed in with a bush. At this elevation, in the places I've been to at least this week, it's been really hard to find areas where you can dig without hitting a rock or a bush. And that might actually be a good thing. We'll touch back on that as well. Cool, yeah, so that's kind of what our snowpack is looking like right now. Oh, some places, as you get higher in elevation, or if you're on more open slopes, there is some old wind slab as well mixed in. This area didn't have wind slab, but in other areas, wind slab does exist. Old wind slab. Cool, as you gain elevation, things start to get kind of scarier. We've been seeing a lot of reactivity before the storm in near tree line and above tree line terrain on our persistent weak layers, which we're going to talk about. Here are two pictures of avalanches. This one is on McGee, and it ran sometime in this last storm. It was observed Monday morning, and the debris ran almost more than halfway to the road, maybe 2/3 of the way to the road, so that's pretty extensive. This one is on Mendenhall, also fairly large, persistent slab avalanche. A little bit scary, if I do say so myself. It freaks me out. Don't freak anyone else out. If it doesn't, you're in the right place, because we're going to learn all about why it should freak you out. Cool, we've got some more persistent slab activity. You can tell it's persistent slab because if you look at the crowns, oh my gosh, they're right under the rocks and they're kind of jaggedy. And you can see that the slide broke almost to the ground, if not to the ground. That tells you it broke on our depth hoar. So, here is a pit from yesterday. Give you an idea of what we're working with. If you know how to read this, this is the hand hardness of the different layers. So you can tell we've got a few different things going on. It looks like our snowpack wants to be right side up. And then we have our facets and our depth ore. So that's what we're working with as of right now. And that leads so fittingly into our topic of the evening, navigating persistent weak layers. As we always call them PWLs, because persistent weak layer is a lot to say. So here I have some Zen pictures, because persistent weak layers are tricky and frustrating and annoying and require a lot of patience. So we're gonna practice our patience by taking a deep breath in, do it with me, and exhaling. Doesn't that feel good? Great. So persistent weak layers. Yay. Love that we're talking about that in the Sierra. For those of you who don't know, persistent weak layers are not very common in February in our traditional snowpack. We have a maritime snowpack. In the Eastern Sierra, we actually tend to get persistent weak layers fairly often early season. But usually we've had some big snowstorms, right? Where we get 5 feet of snow, 8 feet of snow in a couple days. It's not too uncommon for us. And it just kind of gets buried, or it gets crushed, or it gets flushed. We haven't had that this year. We had a lot of really small loading events. And this was our first significant storm. And even still, at lower elevations, it was only a couple feet of snow. Up higher, there's significantly more snow, but we're not there yet. So we'll get into it. We'll dive in. All right. What is a PWL? Does anyone feel like sharing? Is anyone feeling chatty?
PIA.
Yes, it is. It is a PITA. A pain in the... Yes. Yes. So you might recognize these symbols here. This one you'll see on our forecasts if you follow along every morning, which you should. They're chock full of information. This one is used by other forecast centers, but gets the same idea across. Basically what you can see is different layers in the snowpack. A buried layer, and then a break. Ooh. So, what is a persistent weak layer? This is what it is. If those two images didn't make much sense, maybe these will. This is a landmine. I don't know if you're familiar with landmines. Landmines are either on the surface or slightly buried on the surface of the earth, and if you agitate them, they explode. That's what a persistent weak layer does. If you find the right spot and you trigger that weak layer, you're gonna have a bad time. And if you're still wondering what a persistent weak layer is, I have another analogy. Imagine you have a peanut allergy and you are existing in a world where you still like to indulge in food. Some restaurants have a food allergy warning sign, some do not. Some labels of things have allergy warnings, some do not. If you have a peanut allergy, you still might really like chocolate, right? You still might want a Hershey's bar every now and again. That's playing with fire, because Hershey bar is made in a factory with peanuts. So you never know what you're gonna get. Here's a proper definition. This is taken from Avalanche, Canada. Persistent weak layer is a weak layer in the snowpack that resists forming a strong bond to neighboring grains in the snowpack over an extended period of time. So, we have snow falling from the sky, right? It sits on the ground. And then maybe we get more snow falling from the sky, and it sits on the ground. And then maybe we don't get snow for a while. And then we get more snow falling on the ground, and it sits for a while. Each event creates different layers in our snowpack. So, just like this fun rainbow cake, we have layers in our snowpack, and they're from different snowfall events. And when they fall from the sky, they might be in a certain form, if you will, right? A snowflake, a snow crystal. There's lots of different types of snowflakes, different sizes, shapes. Once they're on the ground or on top of snow, they're constantly changing. There's this big fancy word we have, metamorphosis. Maybe you remember it from biology class or Hilary Duff's album. Anyone? No, okay, just me. It's a great album, by the way. The snow grains in our snowpack are constantly changing, and they can change and become more stable and adjust to each other, or they can do the exact opposite. And wait, not that one. That one. And they can refuse to bond with their neighboring snow grains, giving us persistent weak layers. So here's a good picture of what we have going on. This was before our most recent storm event. We had the December depth hoar on the bottom, our early January facets, and then we have here a wind slab on top. Which layers in our snowpack make up persistent weak layers? That's really important to know. The first one is surface hoar. Has anyone ever heard of surface hoar? Yeah. Has anyone in here ever taken an avalanche course? Or maybe an area course or some sort of avalanche education? Yeah, cool. So you've probably heard about surface hoar if you have. It's really fun to talk about. It's really fun to see. It's these beautiful big feathery crystals that form on snow that's already on the ground. So it doesn't fall from the sky. These crystals are on the ground. And basically, if you close your eyes for a second, everyone close your eyes. Imagine you're your younger self and you're on a sports field. Young people play sports often, so try and put yourself on a sports field, and maybe it's like a nice spring day. It's really early in the morning, it's like 7 a.m. and you have to stretch before your game or your event that you're participating in, and the grass is wet. Can you picture it? Yeah? What's the wet stuff on the grass? Dew. Yeah, it's dew. Surface hoar is basically formed by frozen dew. So water in our atmosphere can join or bond, I guess, grow on snow crystals and make these beautiful feathers. And that's how we get surface hoar. You need cold, clear nights for it to form. You need a little bit of moisture in the air, and you don't want any wind. Wind is bad for surface hoar formation. So this is surface hoar. It's really beautiful. It's great to ski if it's on the surface. It's pretty. It makes a cool sound. Makes a whoosh. The problem with surface hoar is it's very delicate, and when it gets buried, it's bad news. It doesn't like to bond with other grains. It doesn't like to support other grains. So that's our first layer that we're thinking of when we're thinking of persistent weak layers. Our second, dun dun dun, I'm sure we've all heard this terrible, terrible word, facets. Facets are very angular snow grains. They don't fall from the sky. They form in the snowpack. Angles, 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 angles. If you're looking at snow crystals ever, think angles. That's your facet. As you can see here in not the most high definition, this guy has snow in his hand and he's shaking it around. It's bouncy, it's sugary. Those are facets. Here's an example of what they look like under a little loop. Facets form in kind of a very complicated process, and we'll try and break it down for those of you who are interested in a few slides. But facets form in our snowpack, and they are a huge problem. Because of their angles, they don't like to bond well with other snow crystals. They don't like to support other snow crystals, and they're very common persistent weak layer. We have facets in our snowpack right now. that we are concerned about. I have this. We also have depth tour. Depth tour looks really cool, but it's terrifying if you want to ski. So depth tour is an aggressively faceted snow grain. It forms a little cup shape. It can be striated with lines on it. They can form chains and get really, really, really big. They do not bond well with other snow crystals. They're very weak. They're very bouncy if you shake them around. And they take a long time to heal. So these are a couple pictures of depth tour from early on in the season. They haven't changed that much, unfortunately. So we're gonna play a little game. Which is which? Which one do you think the feather represents? With a little confidence, come on. What's the feather? Surface whore, yeah, that's the spirit. Okay, which one do you think that the pure cane granulated sugar most represents? Facets, yeah. All right, and what about this one? This is sea salt, Celtic sea salt, if you will. By process of elimination, depth tour. Yeah, so kind of a cool example. The feather, fairly obvious, but granulated sugar versus Celtic sea salt. Celtic sea salt is much bigger, sharper, more angulated, and just like a heftier bit, if you will, a heftier thing. Whereas sugar, they're pretty small, they're super bouncy and fun, but they're not as sharp. If you were to like eat a salt crystal versus a sugar crystal, the salt one's gonna be a little more painful on your tongue. Ah, we did it! We're learning. Great. Lovely. Okay. How do things become facets? Kind of a complicated process, involves some math, but we're gonna try and break it down so you can understand the very, very basics. So, if this intimidates you, I'll just leave it at 2 words. Temperature gradients. Can everyone say that? Temperature gradients.
Temperature gradients.
Yes, thank you for the participation. How fun. Cool, so what's happening here is if you have a snowpack and the ground is always 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which it is, if the air temperature is cold, then you have, well, let me rephrase it this way. So, think, heat likes to travel. It's complicated. I even gotta take a second. All right, so think about it this way. Molecules like to travel from hot to cold, right? Cool. So if our ground is 0 degrees and the air is -4 degrees Celsius or 25 Fahrenheit, they're gonna move from the ground to the air, right? Hot to cold. Very simplified way of thinking about it. So what happens in our snowpack is water vapor will move from warm to cold. Very simplified way to think about it, but that's essentially what's happening. And so water vapor is moving from the ground to the air out of the snowpack. And it's taking with it water vapor that is essentially making the snow crystals really sharp and angular and faceted. Are we following along? I know this was bold going for it, but it's important to know. A lot of people want to know, so here we are. You can ask questions later. I'd love to chat. Yeah, so warm to cold facets. If the air temperature, it's a nice, beautiful 50-degree day, so 11 degrees Celsius, and the ground is still 0, the air is warmer, right? So we're getting water moving from the air, water vapor, from the air down to the ground. Ooh. And that does not create facets, that creates rounding. It's a very simplified way to think about it, but that's what's happening. So if you have cold temperatures and a shallow snowpack, what are you gonna get? Faceting, yeah, there we go. If you have a shallow snowpack and warm temperatures, what are you gonna get? Rounding, yeah, not faceting, exactly. Maybe even melting. Yes, maybe even a melt freeze crust. But let's focus on faceting, because that's what we care about right now. So basically, back to this whole temperature gradient situation, there's a magic number we like to think of, and it's 10%, 1 over 10. If the temperature gradient is smaller than 1 over 10, you're gonna get facets. If it's bigger, you're not gonna get facets. I can write that down for you guys later or something. But just so you have an idea of what's happening. Now, something weird that we have been dealing with this season is we had that awesome warm spell, and it helped our snowpack start to heal. It also gave us some melt freeze crusts. Melt freeze crusts act as a barrier. So instead of the whole snowpack being the situation, you can almost think of it as like, well, now you got 2 snowpacks in terms of this whole temperature gradient situation. So it changes the game. So oftentimes we do get facets forming above and below crusts, which is something that contributes to persistent weak layers, which makes us sad if we want to ski. All right, back to not math science land. Here's a meme and 3 really easy sentences to read. Persistent weak layers are scary because they can be triggered remotely. That's pretty freaky. They can break in really unexpected ways around terrain features. So it's not your typical wind slab, storm slab problem where you can see it, maybe avoid it just by looking around. And then on top of that, you might have absolutely 0 signs of instability. And it's just there. That's why it is this type of headache. And it says persistent weak layers in February, if you can't read the small print. So, persistent weak layers give me a lot of anxiety because they can create persistent slab avalanches. So, a persistent slab avalanche is an avalanche problem that is defined by a slab formed over a persistent weak layer. New snow that accumulates and consolidates over a persistent weak layer is normally first labeled as a storm slab until the persistent nature of the weak layer becomes apparent over time. So early on this season, we had our facets in our depth hoar, and that was our entire snowpack, right? So it wasn't an issue. Once we got a slab on top of it, then it became an issue. So if it's buried, what triggers it? Well, many things can trigger it. All these pictures are in motion to help you understand that change is important for triggering a persistent weak layer. There has to be some sort of instigator, right? And it could be natural. It could be a loading event, such as a storm that produces new snow. Wind loading can produce a slab on top, can load a weak layer. Rain could absolutely do some damage and agitate a weak layer. And sunshine, warmth, is the other thing that can agitate a weak layer because it can help create a slab on top of the weak layer. Humans, you guys, or your pets too actually, can also trigger persistent weak layers. So here you got a snowboarder, a snow machiner, a dog skiing, and someone doing a really cool trick. You got the high five, that's sweet. The average skier moving through the snowpack can affect about 1 meter down, so that's about 3 feet. So even if a weak layer is buried about 3 feet down, your movement can still agitate that layer. If you're hucking cliffs and doing cool tricks, you can access deeper into the snowpack. If you got a snow machine or a snow cat, because you're real fancy, you can access deeper into the snowpack. The bigger the thing, the more force you have, the deeper you can access a weak layer. So this is a really cool diagram taken from the great Bruce Jameson, if you've ever heard his name. He's a very well-respected person in the snow science community. Made this really cool graphic basically explaining what happens. So with persistent weak layers, they're buried, right? You can't see them. In this picture, the orange line is the persistent weak layer. This fellow is skiing down. He skis over a rock, doesn't affect the layer. Skis over another rock, doesn't even notice because it's buried in the snowpack. But the third rock he skis over, the force that he's generating by skiing is enough to access where that layer is buried. It's shallow enough in that one spot that his force triggers and agitates that layer. And what does that do? That causes, you can see in the black, a crack to propagate along the layer, the continuous layer, and eventually a slab releases and takes the skier with him. Hopefully not, but takes the skier with him. How do we know where these layers are? Well, if there are no signs of instability, you might not know. So back to this picture, you might not be able to see where the layer is buried. You might know it's there. You might see a slope and think, oh, cool, it's not here. You might even dig a pit somewhere, right? And be like, oh, I don't see it. It's not reactive. Cool. Great. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to be found further down the slope. So there are a couple signs that can help us stay attuned to the fact that persistent weak layers are around. Shooting cracks and woofing are two things we talk about in our forecast. Maybe you've read or heard us talk about before. A shooting crack is exactly what it sounds like. I was standing right here and a crack shot out about 50 feet on its own accord. And in digging down, what does that look like? You can see the crack shoots across the surface, but actually it's shooting across that weak layer. So you can see right where that fun little thing is. The yellow whoopah. That's the weak layer. And so you can see that the crack on the surface is just an indication of what's happening beneath the surface. So it's honestly, in a way, a nice thing if you can get cracking on low angle slopes, because it tells you that the problem exists. It's giving you feedback, right? Feedback is something we don't always have when we're out traveling in the backcountry for our decision making. Sometimes we don't know if we made the right decision or not, except for the fact that, cool, we all made it home safe, great. But that doesn't necessarily tell us that we made the right decisions. We might have gotten lucky. So it's kind of nice when you're in low angle terrain to see stuff like this, because it's a clear indicator, whoa, okay, I need to back off. What's scary is that if you were on a slope that was steep enough to slide, this would be an avalanche. Where persistent weak layers get scary is no signs of instability until you hit a trigger point. So just like our little skier diagram man, here, this is a picture taken by one of our forecasters earlier this season. It's a perfect example of a buried rock with our snowpack structure laid perfectly on top. So we have facets, and then we have we have depth hoar, and then we have our January facets. And if you were to be skiing down the slope, you wouldn't see that that rock is there until you hit it. And in hitting it, you can cause the whole slope to collapse. Yeah. Another place where you can find trigger points is convexities. Anyone heard the term convex rollover? Yeah? Cool, so that tends to be a thin spot in the snowpack as well. Our general thin spots are buried things such as rocks, trees, and shrubs, and convexities. We can find them at the edges of wind slabs. We can find them near really steep, rocky terrain, like if you're hucking cliffs and really cool stuff. That's where you're gonna find the persistent weak layer. So, yeah. Wait, the other thing is what we're dealing with now at some of our upper elevations is depth. So some of our persistent weak layers are buried 6 to 9 feet deep at this point. We're not going to be able to experience signs of instability unless it's actively loading, more or less. That doesn't mean it's not reactive. And something we've been seeing a lot this season is in our travels, we're not getting signs of instabilities in these places where it's deeper, notably in Mammoth, up near the crest. But we're seeing big avalanches fail on this layer. And in our pit tests, we're getting results. So the layers at this point aren't healed, but they are deeper. So we're not getting the same signs of instability. And that's, if there's one thing you take away from this evening, I would like it to be that, because that's where people get into a lot of trouble. We're coming across that point of persistent slab. In some areas, it's even a deep persistent slab problem. And that is a very, very large avalanche that is very likely unsurvivable. So, you can trigger a persistent weak layer remotely, just to add to the terror. You can trigger it from a meadow below a slope. You can trigger it from a ridge above a slope. Or you could trigger it from a slope and it'll just break in a different part of the slope. So when you're out there making decisions, making your plans for the day, that's something to think about. The first person or the 20th person on a slope can trigger a persistent weak layer. There's kind of a saying that goes, tracks on a slope mean that you haven't found the trigger point yet. So it's a common kind of, if you will, like a heuristic where we see tracks on a slope, right? And we're like, oh, someone skied that. Cool, I can go ski that. It looks great. Heck yeah. With persistent weak layers, totally different story. Totally different story. As you can see in this picture, the second track triggered the slope to go. So how do we navigate around persistent weak layers, right? Because we've just been talking about how scary and terrifying they are. Great. We do other things. We go to the beach, go for a bike ride, make some bread. You can pow surf. You can Nordic ski. I went Nordic skiing for the first time this year. That was kind of fun. You can do like a little backyard park sesh. Woo. You can still be stoked on snow and avoid this terrifying problem. But say you really do want to ski because, I mean, I really want to ski. Or maybe it's not even skiing you want to do. Maybe you want to go ice climbing. You have to navigate this problem. Or maybe you just want to go for a hike with your dog, or just want to enjoy the outdoors. How do we navigate this problem? It's not something we're familiar with in the Sierra at this point in the season. So what do we do? Are we stuck doing only other things? Are we stuck at home?
Below 30 degrees.
Oh, thank you for the participation. Yeah, so terrain choice. Terrain out of everything is the one thing that we can choose and we can control where we go on a given day. So terrain choice, terrain choice, terrain choice, terrain choice, terrain choice. Terrain is everything. And where do we want to go if we're dealing with persistent weak layers? Thank you for your comment. Can you say it one more time?
Below 30 degrees where the cool kids are.
Yeah, we get some hippie pow turns. Woo! As in low angle terrain, as in not avalanche terrain, as in slopes that are below, what we generally say is slopes that are below 30 degrees. This comes with some caveats, as does everything in this world. If you've ever gone out with a guide or taken an avalanche course and you ask a question, you probably heard the two words, it depends. It depends. So when we're talking about avalanche terrain, we generally say 30 degrees, but 30 degrees is kind of like, here's a fun way to put it. If you're going to a casino and you want to place a bet on something, maybe the table, the blackjack table, has like a $5 buy-in. That's just the buy-in. 30 degrees is just the buy-in for avalanche terrain. So depending on the problem, depending on where you are, what's going on, we're really thinking about the average angle of the whole slope. And it's really hard to gauge that when we're in the field. And even our really cool, awesome, advanced technology is not 100% accurate. And so we say 30 degrees as kind of like the general buy-in. But sometimes avalanches release on slopes that are 29 degrees. Sometimes they release on slopes that are 42 degrees. Sometimes 38 degrees. It really depends. But when we are talking about avalanche terrain, a good rule of thumb is just to leave a large margin for error. I have a friend and fellow forecaster up in Bridgeport who likes to say, large marge is in charge. Large margin for error. Give yourself plenty of room to make mistakes. Plenty of room for your technology to not be accurate. Plenty of room for your own ability to assess terrain angles to be inaccurate as well. So here we have, this is just a screenshot of CalTopo. Has anyone ever used CalTopo before? Or maybe Gaia, or Onyx Backcountry, or Avenza, any of these mapping apps? Sweet. Well, if you haven't already in your use of mapping apps, I recommend you find the slope angle shading layer and put it on your map and keep it there. You'll notice in the Sierra we have a lot of slope angle shading because a lot of our terrain is avalanche terrain. And so when we're dealing with a persistent weak layer, it's really, really, really important to know where our steeper slopes lie and where our moderate to steep slopes lie. This is taken from the Sherwins. I chose it in particular because I was there yesterday and I noticed a skin track that went straight up a very steep slope. And I took my probe out to measure the slope, and then I took out my fancy app to measure the slope to double check, and then I took out CalTopo, and I wish this laser worked. And the skin track went right through the center of a slope, and the average angle of the slope was 36 degrees.
Who did?
I don't know who did it. Anyone want to fess up? Nah, it's okay. But we have a lot of avalanche terrain in our mountains, and because we ski here all the time, or maybe even if we're new skiing here, maybe we're good skiers, maybe it's because it's close to town, I don't know. Oftentimes it might not seem like heady avalanche terrain, but it actually is. I'm sure some of you have been in Mammoth and looked up at the Sherwins and seen these beautiful ski runs all the way from the top of the ridge down to the meadows below. Yes? Yeah. Those are avalanche paths. That's why they're beautiful ski runs. The trees don't exist because they've been taken out by avalanches. So, just something to think about. Use technology, figure out where avalanche terrain is, identify it. You can use it while you're in the field. You can use it while you're making plans to go out in the field. And then, beyond that, we'll talk about overhead hazard first before I continue. So the other thing to think about with avalanche terrain is not just being in avalanche terrain, but being beneath it, right? With our persistent weak layers, they can be triggered remotely. So you could be in the meadows below and trigger an avalanche if it's reactive enough. Yeah, kind of scary. So as you're traveling, you want to also be mindful of your overhead hazard. I like to say you don't want to be the overhead hazard, and you don't want to be beneath the overhead hazard. Unfortunately, there have been many avalanche accidents that have occurred from people higher up on a slope triggering an avalanche remotely to people, or burying people lower down on a slope. So you really want to be mindful in what you're doing, not only for your own safety, but for the safety of other people out there as well, especially with persistent weak layers. This translates to our normal avalanche problems that we deal with, and just in general when we're out in the backcountry, we always want to be respectful of other people around. But especially with persistent weak layers, our snowpack is a little bit different and a little bit more dangerous, and we can trigger things remotely and not even mean it, and we don't want to do anything that could seriously harm other people. So don't put yourself in harm's way, and don't be the harm to other people. Move with intention. When we're in the mountains, especially with the persistent weak layer, it's super important to be intentional in how you travel. Everyone's entitled to their own decision making and their own creative process with how you want to tour, where you want to go, if you're going ice climbing, hiking, etc., etc. But there are a few rules of thumb that are going to help keep you safe and help keep everyone around you safe and limit your exposure. So making a plan at home and sticking to it is like the number one thing that you can do to set yourself up for success. Because I never heard the phrase, prior proper preparation prevents poor performance.
Piss poor performance.
Well, yeah, I was just trying to keep it, appropriate. I guess that's not appropriate. Prior proper preparation prevents piss poor performance. Yes, great. So, and these are things that we do as professionals as well. Set yourself up for success, make a plan at home, and stick to it. Give yourself a backup plan at home. So you're not in the field, something's happened, and you're like, oh no, I gotta do this, I gotta do that, there's an emergency. Give yourself an exit strategy, always. Second thing, close questionable terrain. So we do this all the time. We close any terrain that we have a question about, and we just don't go there for the day. And that's that. It makes it really easy to deal with your ski partners. If you're like, oh dude, that line looks sick though, we haven't seen any signs of instability, come on. It's a great way to just be like, nah man, we closed the terrain, like, we can't go there. That's that. We talked about this. Versus having to sit and argue for 30 minutes about whether or not you can ski it. It makes it a lot easier to say no to some of those harder, questionable decisions. And the other thing is never opening terrain in the field. Never taking observations you make in the field to decide to ski something on that day. Maybe you're in the field and you're like, cool, we didn't observe anything, we feel super comfy about this slope, and it's, we actually went out there and it's not avalanche terrain, and there's not even snow above us in the start zone because it's all wind scoured, like, we feel really good about this. That's great. Go home, eat dinner, have some hot cocoa, and sit on those thoughts in a really nice, comfy environment, and then make your decision for the next day. We really want to try and avoid getting lured in to the bluebird pow day, best run ever kind of deal, because that is time and time again how people get sucked in to these traps and how people find themselves in really, really awful situations, especially with persistent weak layers. So make a plan at home, stick to it, close questionable terrain, and never open terrain in the field. We do this as professionals. I recommend it to everyone in terms of dealing with persistent weak layers. Again, to give yourself that large margin of safety, if you will, improve your chances at success and making it home for dinner so you can ski again another day. Okay, we're gonna play a little game. And while I play this game, I want to point out on the picture behind, there's tons of tracks in the background on a slope that's the same aspect and elevation. And then there's like 5 tracks just to the right of where a track triggered this persistent slab avalanche. And I wish this laser pointer worked, but there's actually multiple tracks going into the line where the persistent slab avalanche crown is. So you know that the first person to ski right there wasn't even the person to find the trigger point. So the other thing to point out here is, I don't know if you can see this, but all these little dots down here are people. They chose to hang out right here and watch their friends ski, which is super fun, woohoo! But they chose a really poor spot because they are currently getting avalanched on. And in this situation, all these people were fine. I was reading the accident report, they're all fine. But it brings up the point of when you're skiing and you're dealing with persistent weak layers, even if you're feeling pretty confident about your choice, where you choose to stand or where you choose to meet your buddy after skiing the run is a big deal. So, let's go through a little true-false game. This is going to require participation, by the way. So, feel free to raise your hands or shout out the answer. Number 1, if there's already tracks on the slope, it's fine. Yeah, we just talked about that. I gave you that answer. Okay, true or false? Moderate danger. Ooh, we haven't talked about that yet. Moderate avalanche danger means it's fine.
False.
You're saying false. I hope you understand why you're saying false. Does anyone have a thought on that? Do they want to share?
Depends on the moderate.
Oh, it depends on the moderate.
There's a lot of different problems, and I don't know. I feel like the term spooky moderate is one that comes up in conversation a lot. But yeah, it depends on the moderate, and depends on where you are and the terrain you're skiing.
Totally. Yeah, so, and we'll touch on that in a couple slides, but moderate danger is not, with persistent weak layers, is a very different story than moderate danger with a wind slab or a storm slab. All right, next one. Islands of safety will keep me safe.
So how safe that island is.
It depends. Yeah, so it depends. That one you could go either way with that one. No one's wrong. I liked your answer. Can you say it one more time?
I mean, it depends on how safe the island is. Like, we say sometimes if you're skiing a couloir to like dip behind a rock so your buddy can see a ski as an island of safety from like if he kicks a tiny wind slab. But that's not safe if there's a persistent slab that's going to trigger the whole thing.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you. Yeah, so an island of safety is going to be a totally different story with a persistent weak layer than a wind slab or a storm slab. All right, next one. We can reduce exposure by having only one person on the slope at a time. Yeah! For uphill and downhill, if we're dealing with steep sections and we've made some mistakes maybe, or we found ourselves in an area where the terrain is steeper than we thought it would be, the best thing we can do if we can't turn around for whatever reason is move one at a time. That way if something does happen, it's only one person you're looking for versus 4. All right, if I get no test results in a pit, then the layer is unreactive. Yeah, it might not be reactive exactly where you are for one reason or another. There could be some human error, but that does not mean that the layer is unreactive. If it's deeper than 100 centimeters, I don't have to worry about it.
You should worry more.
That's a great answer, thank you. Yeah, so is it true or false? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I had someone come up to me in the last couple weeks, and I was digging a pit, and they were like, oh, like, what are you finding? And I was like, I got a ECTP 14, and they're like, ooh, well, how deep was it? And I was like, oh, it was about 120 centimeters, actually. And they're like, oh, cool, so, like, it's more than 100 centimeters. And I was like, well, yeah. And they're like, oh, cool, sounds good. Okay. And then an hour later, I saw them skiing down a 45-degree slope, and nothing happened, but I saw them skiing right through the gut of a 45-degree slope where I had just gotten a result of an ECTP 14. So, it doesn't mean that it's not possible. It means you should worry more. So, here's some color coding in case you had any questions about what was true and what was false. The green is true, the red is false, the yellow isn't, it depends. Sweet, so we're gonna circle back to that moderate thought. Here's our North American Public Avalanche Danger Scale. And we use this as forecasters to communicate with all of you what the danger is. And essentially, if you look at this picture, you can find it on the internet, you can find it on our website. It gives you very specific things associated with each rating. It goes into travel advice, likelihood, and size and distribution. And we tend to find, come back to that. No, we'll go to it. We tend to find that a lot of people have this idea that the danger scale is linear, that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that is not the case. So the way it works is it's actually an exponential graph. Low doesn't mean that avalanche danger is impossible. It just means it might be very isolated or hard to find or unreactive or stubborn. When you get into moderate and considerable, that's where most accidents happen. And it usually tends to be right on that line of moderate, considerable, maybe spooky moderate. As the danger gets closer to red, people kind of back off, is what we've seen and people who do research in this realm have seen. But there's a big difference between a moderate here and a moderate here. And there's an even bigger difference between a considerable here and a considerable up there. Up there. So when we put out a forecast to you all, we give you a color and a danger rating. But if you're someone who likes to ski avalanche terrain, or if you're gonna go travel through the backcountry and you have to travel through avalanche terrain to get to your ice climb, or because you wanna go on a cool hike, you wanna climb Mount Whitney, etc., etc., I highly encourage you to actually read into the details of the forecast, because we'll address kind of where we're at within the danger. It goes beyond the color. So for those people who maybe haven't taken the time to come to this event and get educated as you fine folks, and ski an avalanche terrain, they might just look at the color and go. But you folks, now that you've been here and are getting more educated, I really encourage you to read into the forecast so you can get an idea of where within the rating we are and what specifically we're looking at. This fun human over here brought up spooky moderate. Spooky moderate is a very spooky thing, because oftentimes we use that term when we refer to persistent weak layers that are either deeper in the snowpack and showing not a lot of signs of reactivity, or when we have persistent weak layers that are starting to become unreactive and stubborn, but you can still trigger them from just the right spot. So it's a really, really, really spooky thing, and it kind of goes back to all the things we've been talking about of trigger points, and you could be the 20th person on a slope to trigger something. So spooky moderate, different than low moderate, right? This awesome diagram is based on a number of studies that have been done, and it kind of shows us where most avalanche accidents happen. And a lot of people think it's when the danger's high or during a storm. That's actually not true. It's on the sunny days after a storm and the avalanches are breaking on persistent weak layers buried in the snowpack. So the danger could be it could be considerable or moderate, but it's in these persistent weak layers where you're getting more avalanche accidents. Because, I mean, they're really hard to gauge. You can't outsmart them. The only thing you can do is manage your terrain choice. We like to think about this in terms of risk versus reward. So, persistent weak layers, what we're worried about is a high risk, low frequency situation or a high risk, high frequency situation. It's easy when it's high risk, high frequency because hopefully you'll heed the warnings and you won't go, or you'll stay out of avalanche terrain, or you'll go bake bread, or you'll go do something else for the day. It's super scary when it's high risk, low frequency, as in when it's deeper, right? When you're not getting those signs of instability and it's harder to trigger, or as the layer is just starting to heal. So persistent weak layers can be created fairly quickly, but they can take weeks to heal. So persistent problems require persistent patience. They are quick to form and slow to heal. Choose your partners wisely. Manage your terrain choices. You can't outsmart the problem. It just doesn't work. Follow the forecast for continual snowpack updates and evaluation. And thank you for coming to learn about persistent weak layers.